Hi there. So tonight what we're going to be doing is looking at how we can actually use the results that come back from a REST call in iOS using Swift. We're going to make some modifications to our program that we've written so far, and we're going to focus on the getting the data back, and then being able to put that into a table view. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to do actually is we need to add authorization, and this wasn't in our previous example, so I'd just like to show you this code. This will allow us to authorize, because we've added authorization in addition to the API key check. So this is all we were doing before, was just checking to see if the API key was set, but now we're actually using basic authentication on the endpoint. And so we need to have the user ID and password. So we have a username and a password. And then we set up an authorization string, which the username and password is basically going to be username : password. And then we are going to base64 encode that. And then the other thing we need to do is make sure that we actually add the authorization as part of the headers here. So we do that. So the idea, here is the call that we're going to be making. We're going to be calling the person endpoint. And we expect to get back this list. And we are going to actually write code in Swift that will go through and create an object for each one of these and store it in an array of objects. And we'll be able to use that data to actually store the data in the table view itself. Okay? All right, so to do this, the first thing we're going to need to do is, I'm really not going to get too far into the details of how you develop iOS applications, but basically you're all probably familiar with the idea of how you can have an iOS app where you press a button and it slides to another view, and this is usually a navigation controller. And so the first thing we need to do is modify our existing storyboard, which only is just a single view, and we're going to actually add a navigation controller which will handle sliding in the new view, and that new view will have the table view on it. And so we will go ahead and add that. Before we do that though, let's go ahead and run this, and just so you can see what it's currently doing. And what we've done, so we have the authorization code that we showed you up here. And this is the data coming back. And so I've made some modifications here. So basically what we're doing is getting parsed data back as an NS array, and then we're iterating through that and printing out the object of the last name for each item that comes through. So this is some code that you can use to iterate through. We have the response coming back here, or the response data here. This is the data that comes back from the actual URL, the get call. It's stored in this data, and then we set that equal to the response data, and then we go through and use this code here. Let parse data equals try JSON serialization. JSON serialization is a library class that you can use from Apple. There are lots of JSON serialization, deserialization libraries out there. I'm not using any of those, so you're welcome to try to use those. I wanted to just keep this example to be basic to just what is provided out of the box from Apple, however. So this just iterates through. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So this is going to run in our simulator. And when we hit get, this code should be executed. And what you'll notice is it's gone through and printed out the last names. And if we look over here on Postman, these are the actual last names that we're getting back from the call. So that's all working the way it's supposed to. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and proceed. So to add the navigation controller and get the table view, so there's a couple of ways we could do this. One is we could just put the table view on this view itself. I decided to go ahead and use the TableView Controller, which is built in, and it's a nice way to get a simple table view up and working. It is kind of limited in what you can do with it, but it's great for just doing an out-of-the-box example like this. So you may want to actually have a table view independently on your own view and do that type of work with it. But what we're going to do is we're going to start by highlight in our storyboard. We're going to highlight our view controller that we have here. And under Editor, we're going to select Embed In, and we're going to select Navigation Controller. So what that's going to do is it's going to embed this view that we currently have in a navigation controller. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a table view controller. Not a table view, but an actual table view controller. So if you'll drag that on here. So this is going to be the table view that we actually use to display the results that come back from the get. We're actually going to move all of the get code into the table view controller code because that just makes it easier. We could get the data from this view controller and then push it over to the other view, but that's kind of not very object oriented to do things that way. The next thing we're going to do is create a segue. So a segue is a way to take a particular action like a button click and have it invoke another view. So to do that, what we're going to do is hold the control key down and drag from the get to the table view, and you'll notice a list of segues come up, and we want the show action segue. So if you'll hit show. So now this is all wired up. So let's run this again and see what happens. What we would expect to happen is the get, and the get code's still going to run, but it's also going to segue over to this table view. So let's go ahead and run this. Again, make sure that you pick the table view controller, not the table view. And we're going to work with these prototype cells here in just a minute. I'll show you how to use those. So I'm going to leave the simulator running so that we don't have to wait for it to launch every time. Sometimes it gets hung a little bit, but so you'll notice what it did is it pushed over to the table view, and then if I hit the back button, it brings me back here. So that's what the navigation controller gave us, is it gave us this navigation capability with the back, which is a standard iOS app, and it makes it really easy to handle navigation. Okay, so we'll stop that application from running. All right, let's look at our cells here that we're going to use. So basically what happens with the table view controller is, well, actually, before we get into that, what we need is we need a class that we can use with this table view, controller. And so what we're going to do is we're going to right-click over here on our folder, and we're going to select New Cocoa Touch Class. And we want it to be derived by, we want the class, you can name it whatever you'd like. I'm going to leave it the default of TableView Controller. And we want it to be a subclass of UI TableView Controller. So we'll just hit Next on that and hit Create. So what that did was created this class, and this is a skeleton TableView Controller class that has all of the code in it to manage a table view, to actually do the loading and everything. So this is why we use this. It makes it really nice. We're going to go back to our storyboard, and on our table view, we are going to set the class of this table view controller. And we want to make this class be the class that we just created. So it's this TableView Controller class. And the module is the call rest example, which is the current module that I happen to be in. Okay. So now that view is now wired to this code. So I can now work with this code. This code's going to get called whenever the table view needs to load. So just so you're aware, the way table views work in iOS is they call back delegates. They have delegates associated with it. So if we look at this and we look at the delegates for the table view, it's looking for a data source delegate and just a regular code delegate. So it says, where am I going to get my data and where am I going to get my delegate functions that I have, or methods. And those delegates are defined in the library, and some of them are things like number of sections, number of rows in section, and we are going to actually use this here, which is the table view that will actually load the cells. So you can learn more about table views and how they work. I don't really want to dive too far into the tutorial, trying to do a tutorial around that. But we are using this to display our data coming back from our REST web service. Okay, so let's go to our cell now. So we have this cell, and we need to set some properties on it. And what we want is we want the cell to be, let's see, the style we want to be write detail. So what that will put on here is it'll allow us to have a title and a detail, and then an identifier. So cell ID is going to be the identifier. This identifier can be any valid identifier. I just picked that one. Again, write detail and cell ID. So let's look at how we might actually use this. So opening up our TableView Controller code, what we want to do is uncomment this function right here. And the reuse identifier is the identifier I set, which is cell ID. So that's C-E-L-L, capital I, capital D. And then here is where we actually can set the properties on that cell. For example, we can say cell text label. So what I'm going to do is just put in some false data, some test data. And what I'm filling out is I'm filling out the two parts of the prototype cell. One is the title and one is the description, essentially. And we're going to go ahead and run this. So just to review quickly in the storyboard, so what I'm doing is I'm setting the value that appears here under title and the value that appears under detail. And those are in the cell text label and the cell detail text label. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, so nothing happened, and that's to be expected, and there's a reason why, and that is that table views have numbers of sections, so you can have sections or groups. We want to have one section. We want the entire table to just be a section. And then you will be called to find out how many rows are in this particular section. So for each section, it will iterate through and call you and say, okay, how many rows are in this section? And we're gonna drive this off how many elements come back from the REST call, but right now I'm just going to hard code it as 5. This is just so we can make sure that our table view is working properly. And so there you see it just repeated the same data over and over again. Okay. So that's how you can implement a table view. And we also talked about authentication with REST. So now we're ready to move ahead and actually get the data from our REST call. So what we are going to do, the first thing we will do is create a person class. So this is just going to be a Swift file, and it's going to be called person. And you'll remember when we were doing this in .NET, we created a model. And so you can think of this as a model. And we're just going to say class person. And it is going to have the following properties. First name as a string. And we will initialize this to just empty. And last name as a string. Again, initialized to nothing. And pay rate. And this will be a float. And we're just going to initialize that to 0. Okay, and then we have 2 dates. We have a start date and an end date. And those will be of type date. And I'm just going to initialize them with current date, but they'll be those values will be replaced with the actual date coming back from the data. And that's all there is to our class. It's just a little model class that we're going to use to actually be able to store our data that comes back. All right. So I'm going to pause for just a minute and I'll come right back. So what we need to do now is load our array, an array of person objects, with the data that comes back from our REST call. So to do that, first thing we need to do is move all this code around get. So this is the get pressed method. So remember, this is asynchronous. So that's important because I want you to imagine that the table view is going to come up and it's going to try to load data, and there isn't going to be anything there yet because it's still trying to load it from the REST call. It'll make the REST call asynchronously, get the data, and then it's going to tell the table view to reload itself, is essentially what's going to happen. So we will copy this and put this in our table view code here, and we're going to change it a little bit. Basically just the method name. We don't want it to be called press get, and we don't want it to be an IB action because it's not tied to a UI thing. So this is just going to be called load data. Let's just do that. And then we don't need any parameters here, so we'll delete that. Everything else can stay the same. And then in viewDidLoad, whenever any view loads, this method is called. So what we're going to do is call load data. So when this view comes up, it's going to run this code and execute the get. Now what we need to do is right here, instead of just printing out the objects, we need to do this. We need to get us a person object. This is a person object that's been initialized with the values that are in the class. And then what we're going to do is set the properties. First name is going to be equal to an object first name. That's what's coming from our JSON. And that is as a string. Okay, and we will repeat this for our last name. So all we've done is we've created an object of the person class, and we're just loading up its data members. Again, there's some JSON deserialization classes out there that you say, well, it'd be a lot easier just to use this code that someone else has written to do all of this. And that is absolutely true. I just don't want to be teaching you someone else's library on top of everything else. So these examples are always meant to work, for the most part, right out of the box. So that's why we're doing it this way. So in programming, there's many, many different ways that you can accomplish a particular task. And this is going to be pay rate. All right, now dates. We have two dates that we're going to be dealing with. And in order to deal with the dates, we have to actually convert the data coming back that's a string into a date object. And so to do that, we need a date formatter. And so up here at the top, we are going to have right here we need a date formatter. And in our view did load, we need to set up the format for our date. And so right down here in the view did load, before we load the data, we're going to say self date formatter. And the date format coming back looks like this. There's a 4-digit year, followed by a dash, followed by a 2-digit month, followed by a 2-digit day, followed by a capital T, followed by a 2-digit hour, 2-digit minute, 2-digit second. So that's the format that our dates come at us from the REST call. And with that, we can then go ahead and set up. We can go ahead in our load code up here, and we can set up our dates. So we have a start date. Okay, now the thing that's different here is we're going to use our date formatter. And it's coming from, the string is coming from the start date object. Like that. And then we can do the same thing for the end date. And it wants, it's going to make it happier. And this is going to be end date. All right, so now we've populated a person object, and so let's set a breakpoint right here and see if it really works so far. Let's try that out. So here's our simulator running. Now remember that we left all the get code sitting over in the other view, so what's going to happen is it's going to actually be making 2 REST calls. We don't want that, but this is we're just testing to start with here. And then we'll do some code cleanup. Okay, so it's launching our app. Okay, so it hit the breakpoint. Now what you'll notice is that this all loaded first, and then it finally hit our breakpoint, and that's because of the asynchronous nature of it. So here in the debugger, we can tell it to print an object, the person. Okay. I guess it's out of scope here. So let's continue. So there is a person out there, and if we say PO person start date, you'll see there's the actual date that came back from the REST call. So, and if we put first name in here, so there it has silly in there as first name. So that all seems to be working the way we want it to. So what we don't have is we don't have it in an array. So the next thing we need to do is create an array that we can load this data into. So up here we're going to create an array of persons. So we'll call it the person array. It is made up of person objects, and it is going to start out empty like that. So we've declared an array of type person, and now what we can do right here is actually append. You can say self person array append, and we can give it the object that we just created. All right. Now, when this is done, we want to tell the table view to reload itself. I'm sorry, there's a little IntelliJ. Let's take that out. So this will cause the table to reload itself. But we need to modify our code down here. We still want only one section, but we're not going to return 5 values. What we want to return is self person array count. However many items are in the person array count. Now initially when the table view first loads, that'll be 0, and so nothing will get loaded. But as it loads asynchronously and it tells it to reload, it'll call all these methods again, and when it does that, it'll go based on the count that's set up. And then down here, what we want to do is we want to get the data out of the array. So instead of hard coding it like this, we're going to say self.person array, and the index into the array, index path, every time this method is called, the index path contains the row and the section. We know that the section is always 1, so we don't really care about the section number. If you were grouping the data, you'd care about the section. But in this case, all we can really care about is the row. And so that is going to be index path dot row. And it is index origin 0, which is great because we can map it right into our array index. So this says it's going to say, okay, you told me, let's say there's 5 things coming back. You told me there's 5, I'm going to call you 5 times. It's going to call this method 5 times, and the first time it's going to index path row is going to be 0, which is the first element in our array by index, which is great. So let's grab the last name. And then over in the description, let's throw the, I don't know, you get a pick of any of the properties that you want to use. We can go ahead and put first name in here. And let's try it out. This should all now be working. And we should be able to see our table populate based on a REST call. Just as a refresher and a reminder, this is the data that we expect to get back. This data that's coming back from on this REST call. So let's hit get. And there's our data. We'll do that again. And there it is. And you'll notice it doesn't immediately pop up because it's making an asynchronous call to go get it. So that's all there is to it. And you can change these values that you want to display here to whatever you want. For example, let's look at if we wanted to do a date there. So maybe we wanted to use their start date. And to do that, we need to format out a date. So we're going to say self.date formatter. And it's going to come from all of this, except for it's going to be start date. Actually, let's do end date. So this is just using the date formatter method to turn the date coming from our class, which our person class, which is the type date, it's got to be converted into a string in order for us to use it. So we'll run that real quick. And there you see our dates coming back. And if we go compare this to what's in Postman, you'll notice it's the same data. So that's how you can use an iOS TableView and TableView Controller to display the results coming back from a REST call. But we have it in an array of person objects, so it could be you could do anything you wanted with it. If you needed to write it into a database, or write it into a file, or display it in a way other than using a table view, you could certainly do that. And you may wonder about it being a little bit clunky to convert it into an array, but the nice thing about getting into a person array is now you're dealing with it in actual dates and floats. You're not dealing with it as strings as it comes from REST. So I hope this was useful to you. This video is done based on a request that was made to say, well, okay, you showed us how to go get the data using iOS, but we don't know how to actually process the data. So this hopefully would help you with that. And I hope that this has been useful to you. And again, this is the code in ViewDidLoad of our TableView controller. We added this code, and we just had hard-coded one section, person array count here, and then this is the code that we added in the TableView call that's made. And at the top, we have these two methods, or these two properties, person array and date formatter. And then here is our load code. We had added the authorization code. We went over that. And then we also added this code, which actually iterates through the JSON as it comes back and builds person objects and then adds those into an array, and then finally causes the table to reload its data. So please keep those requests for videos coming, and like the videos please in YouTube if you find these to be useful. That helps everyone. And thanks so much for watching.